Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that the person ruling one of the largest empires on earth has been surrounded by rumors for centuries. Rumors about secret lovers, secret letters, secret enemies, secret decisions, and behind all of them, one question keeps returning. What was Catherine the Great really hiding? Catherine II, better known to history as Catherine the Great, remains one of the most fascinating and controversial rulers of the 18th century. She was a foreign-born princess who entered Russia as a young woman, survived a miserable marriage, became empress through a dramatic coup, and eventually transformed Russia into one of Europe's most powerful states. But the woman behind the crown was far more complicated than the image of the powerful empress. She was intelligent, ambitious, politically ruthless, intellectually curious, and remarkably skilled at controlling the way people saw her. And that last quality may be the key to understanding the secrets surrounding her life. Because Catherine did not simply rule Russia. She carefully constructed Catherine the Great. She understood something that many rulers never fully understood. Power is not only about what you do. Power is also about the story people believe about what you do. And Catherine was exceptionally good at controlling that story. Her journey began far from the Russian throne. She was born Sophie of Anhalt, Zerbst in 1729, a minor German princess with no obvious path to becoming one of the most powerful women in European history. As a teenager, she was brought to Russia because Empress Elizabeth wanted her to marry the heir to the Russian throne, Grand Duke Peter. Sophie converted to Russian Orthodoxy and took the name Catherine. But the marriage was deeply unhappy. Peter was immature, eccentric, and openly difficult. Catherine, meanwhile, began educating herself. She studied Russian history, philosophy, literature, politics, and the writings of Enlightenment thinkers. While her husband seemed increasingly incapable of understanding the world around him, Catherine was learning how to survive inside it. And perhaps more importantly, she was learning how to control it. This is where the first major mystery of her story appears. Did Catherine begin dreaming of the throne because she was forced into a terrible marriage? Or had she already discovered that she could be far more powerful than the man who was supposed to become emperor? The answer is difficult to prove, but what we do know is that Catherine gradually built relationships with powerful figures within the Russian elite. She learned who supported Peter, she learned who hated him, she learned who could be trusted, and she learned who could not. Then in 1762, everything changed. Peter became emperor after the death of Empress Elizabeth. His reign lasted only a few months. Then Catherine moved. With the help of military supporters, particularly members of the Imperial Guard, Catherine seized power. Peter abdicated. Soon afterward, he was dead. And that death became one of the darkest shadows hanging over Catherine's reign. Officially, Peter's death was attributed to natural or medical causes. But rumors of assassination spread almost immediately. Was Catherine directly responsible? Historians have debated the question for centuries. There is no simple piece of evidence that proves she personally ordered his murder. But Catherine certainly benefited enormously from his death. And that distinction is important, because sometimes history does not give us a confession. It gives us circumstances. Catherine had become empress. The woman who had arrived in Russia as a teenage princess was now the ruler of an enormous empire. But becoming ruler was one thing. Remaining ruler was something else entirely. Catherine knew that she had taken the throne through a coup. She was not the legitimate male heir. She was a woman. She was foreign-born, and there were people in Russia who could challenge her authority. So Catherine did something brilliant. She began creating legitimacy. She presented herself as a Russian ruler who understood Russian interests. She cultivated the image of an enlightened monarch. She corresponded with famous European thinkers. She supported education and cultural development. She talked about law and reform. She admired the ideas of the Enlightenment. To many Europeans, Catherine looked like the perfect example of an enlightened despot. But then came the contradiction. The deeper you look into Catherine's rule, the harder it becomes to reconcile her ideals with her actions. She could speak about human freedom while ruling over millions of serfs whose lives were brutally restricted. She could discuss equality and rational government while expanding the power of the Russian nobility. She could criticize tyranny while exercising enormous personal authority. So was Catherine a hypocrite? Perhaps. But there is another possibility. Maybe Catherine understood that idealism and political survival could not always coexist. She wanted reform, but she also wanted power. And when the two came into conflict, power usually won. That contradiction is one of the most fascinating things about her. And it brings us to another part of her story, that history has often exaggerated her love life. If you search for stories about Catherine the Great, you will quickly encounter sensational claims about her romantic relationships. Her enemies created outrageous stories about her sexuality. Some of those stories became so extreme that they overshadowed almost everything else she accomplished. But much of the most famous material is simply propaganda. The infamous story involving a horse, for example, is a fabricated legend. It was designed to humiliate Catherine after her death. And this tells us something important. Sometimes the secret is not what Catherine was hiding. The secret is what her enemies were hiding about themselves. They were hiding their fear of a powerful woman. Catherine had violated expectations. She was a woman who had taken control of an empire. She commanded armies. She defeated enemies. She controlled court politics. She had lovers, yes, but powerful male rulers had lovers too. Yet Catherine's private life became a weapon against her in a way that was rarely applied with equal intensity to male monarchs. Her sexuality became part of the political mythology surrounding her. And the more powerful she became, the more aggressively her enemies attacked her reputation. But Catherine's relationships were not simply romantic. Some of the men closest to her were also politically important. Grigory Potemkin is perhaps the most famous example. Potemkin was a military commander, administrator, and statesman who became one of Catherine's most influential associates. Their relationship was complex. They were lovers, but they were also political partners, and Potemkin helped shape Russian expansion into territories around the Black Sea. Their correspondence reveals something fascinating. Catherine was not simply a lonely empress surrounded by romantic companions. She was a strategic thinker working with people who could help her achieve enormous political goals. That brings us to one of the biggest transformations of her reign. Russia expanded dramatically under Catherine. The Ottoman Empire was weakened. Russia gained access to the Black Sea. Crimea was annexed by Russia in 1783. Russian influence expanded across Eastern and Southern Europe. Catherine became increasingly important in European diplomacy. She was no longer merely the woman who had taken the throne. She had become an imperial power in her own right. But every empire has a price. And Catherine's expansion came with enormous human consequences. Her government faced rebellion, including the massive uprising led by Yemelyan Pugachev. The rebellion exposed how unstable the empire could become. Peasants and Cossacks rose against the existing order. The uprising frightened Catherine, and after it was crushed, her attitude toward political reform became more cautious. This is another place where the public image of Catherine and the reality of Catherine begin to separate. The enlightened philosopher, Queen could discuss reform in private. But the ruler of Russia had to worry about rebellion, aristocratic opposition, foreign enemies, and the survival of her regime. The result was a ruler who could be surprisingly progressive in some areas and extremely authoritarian in others. And perhaps that is why Catherine remains so difficult to categorize. She was not simply a villain. She was not simply a hero. She was something more uncomfortable. She was a human being with extraordinary power. And extraordinary power reveals contradictions. Catherine also had another concern that is often overlooked: her succession. She had spent decades building her own authority. But who would inherit everything she had built? Her relationship with her son, Paul, was famously difficult. Paul was the legitimate son of Peter III and Catherine. But Catherine did not seem to trust him. She feared his political instincts. She disagreed with him on important matters, and there were even rumors that Catherine considered bypassing him in favor of her grandson Alexander. If true, this would have represented a dramatic attempt to control the future of Russia even after her death. But Catherine never got the chance. In November 1796, she suffered a stroke and died. She was 67 years old, and almost immediately another transformation began. The woman who had controlled her public image during her lifetime could no longer control what happened to her reputation afterward. Her enemies returned, her critics returned, her legends grew, and over time, the real Catherine became buried beneath the myth. But perhaps the most interesting question is not what Catherine was hiding from the world. Perhaps it is what she was hiding from herself, because Catherine spent her entire adult life trying to prove that she belonged. She was born German. She became Russian. She was married to the heir. Then she replaced him. She was a woman in a political world dominated by men. So she became more ruthless, more calculating, and more politically intelligent than many of the men around her. She created an image of herself as indispensable, and perhaps she knew that if people stopped believing in that image, her entire position could collapse. This may explain why Catherine cared so much about intellectual reputation. She wanted philosophers to respect her. She wanted European courts to take her seriously. She wanted Russia to be seen as a great power. She wanted history to remember her as an enlightened ruler. And in many ways, she succeeded. But there is another side of Catherine's legacy that cannot be ignored. Her reign strengthened the Russian Empire. It also strengthened the privileges of the nobility. For many peasants and serfs, life remained extremely harsh. Her territorial expansion brought more people under Russian control. Her policies contributed to the transformation of Russia into a major imperial power. So when we ask, what was Catherine the Great hiding? Perhaps the answer is not one secret. There was no single locked room containing one shocking truth. Instead, Catherine's life was filled with contradictions that she carefully managed. She hid vulnerability behind confidence. She hid uncertainty behind political calculation. She hid the weaknesses of her position behind the image of an unstoppable empress. And sometimes, she allowed other people to believe stories about her because those stories were more useful than the truth. That is what makes her story so fascinating. Catherine understood perception. She understood propaganda. She understood that history is often written by people who control the narrative, and she fought to control that narrative while she was alive. But perhaps the greatest irony is that she could not control it forever. the woman who became one of Russia's most powerful rulers was eventually transformed into a character, a legend, a symbol, a collection of rumors, some true, some partly true, some completely invented. And once a person becomes a legend, separating the human being from the myth becomes almost impossible. So the next time you hear the name Catherine the Great, don't just imagine an empress sitting on a golden throne. Imagine a teenage girl arriving in a foreign country. Imagine a young woman trapped in a political marriage. Imagine someone realizing that survival required intelligence. Imagine her studying the people around her. Imagine her making alliances. Imagine her taking a throne that was never supposed to be hers. Imagine the fear of knowing that every powerful person around you could become your enemy. Imagine building an empire while knowing that one political mistake could destroy everything. And then imagine trying to control how history would remember you. That is the real mystery of Catherine the Great, not the sensational rumors, not the exaggerated bedroom stories, not the myths created by enemies. The real mystery is how a foreign princess with almost no obvious path to power became one of the most influential rulers of 18th century Europe. And perhaps Catherine's greatest secret was never something she hid in a letter or locked away in a palace. It was her ability to understand power. She knew that people could forgive cruelty if they believed the ruler was strong. She knew that intellectual sophistication could create legitimacy. She knew that political alliances could be more valuable than friendship. She knew that reputation could be a weapon. And above all, she knew that history remembers stories more easily than facts. Catherine the Great built her own story while she was still alive. And centuries later, we are still arguing about where the story ends and the truth begins. If you enjoyed this journey into the hidden side of Catherine the Great, don't leave just yet. There are countless historical figures whose public image hides a much darker, stranger, and more fascinating reality. So if you want more stories where history goes beyond the textbook and into the secrets, contradictions, betrayals, ambitions, and mysteries that shaped the world we live in today, make sure you like this video, share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe to the channel, because history is not always what we were told. Sometimes, the most interesting story begins when we ask one simple question: what were they trying to hide? And Catherine the Great may have left behind an empire, but she also left behind a mystery that history still hasn't completely solved.